Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome back to Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh and the latest on what is happening here in Canada today. Well, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith are unveiling what would become one of the most consequential energy agreements in modern Canadian history. Why would you say that? Well, because this deal would also mean that Alberta's industrial carbon price will be a part of making sure that there is an expansion on Alberta pipelines when it comes to Alberta oil. So this is plans for major new oil pipelines to British Columbia from Alberta through BC to the coast. And this is something that Prime Minister Mark Carney is calling a grand bargain, because his government will essentially not only expand its pipelines, it'll also link this energy expansion to carbon capture and emissions reduction. The agreement comes as we know that this global oil, energy supply has been a massive issue, has been disrupted. And this is also at a time where there's been a separatist movement in Alberta, and more specifically because of Ottawa's anti-oil legislation in the past decade. And to that, it's caused, we're seeing full force ahead on this movement of, Alberta separatist movement. And so to this, it's coming at a time where this prime minister had to essentially let Albertans know that, hey, Ottawa knows, is listening to you, cares, wants to make sure that Alberta oil gets to the world market. And to that, there has to, also come up with some sort of an agreement in terms of, this carbon capture to make sure that it's being able to offset. So you have Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith. They are going to be unveiling this landmark energy carbon pricing agreement in Calgary today. And this is a massive shift for Canadian energy policy in decades, right? So this deal is expected to link the new West Coast oil pipeline, industrial carbon pricing, carbon capture, AI-driven electricity expansion, and what is of our national unity concerns with the separatist movement that is taking place. Now, the core deal is that Alberta's industrial carbon price would rise because of its expansion on its pipelines. So from $95 a ton today, it will go up to $130 a ton by 2040. This increase would reportedly begin with $100 a ton in 2027. So next year, before gradually climbing to the $130 a ton mark by 2040. It's a condition that had to be met. So there could be, new Alberta pipeline to BC, and that was the criteria which the province and Ottawa have been working on since they struck up their MOU just last fall. Now, Prime Minister Mark Carney is saying that this is very critical because Canada needs to have energy sovereignty because of the Iran war, U.S. trade instability, even though, U.S. still consumes 90% of Canadian oil below market rate. AI electricity demands that are, more of a reality with data centers and everything else, and the global energy insecurity that is taking place right now because of the conflict with Iran. So now Ottawa is trying to change its approach to make sure that it can provide Canadian oil to the markets, and more specifically, the Indo-Pacific region, China, Japan, South Korea, those countries that heavily rely on oil that comes out of the Middle East that have been hit really hard in this, 2+ months conflict with Iran and the United States and Israel. So this is a way that Canada can actually, start addressing some of these concerns. And so this pipeline will be now you have the Prime Minister framing the pipelines, the power grids. We'd made the announcement on, doubling the power grids by 2050. and the investments that Ottawa is putting forward, but then he's tying it to carbon capture and what would be AI infrastructure. And he's lumping all that in terms of what Ottawa is saying now is that these are all national security assets, and it's supposed to position Canada in the best way possible for where the world is headed and Canada's economy. So now Premier Smith essentially agreed, saying that she views the deal as proof Alberta can and still succeed inside of Canada, because she's got to, be able to balance two things. One is, do this deal with Ottawa and be the premier that sees it through, but also make sure Albertans who elected her, because she promised that she would hold a referendum if there was enough of a signature petition to hold a referendum. So this is something that she has to now start kind of talking pro Canada, because they're getting pipelines. And she did a deal to bring down, even though it increases the carbon pricing, but it's less than what was projected previously. And having Ottawa support and money to be able to start the pipelines and also attract foreign investment and have, and show that level of stability for companies to come and want to invest in building out the pipelines. So she's got this entire fine line to walk. And, the latest numbers was there was 301,000 signatures, and you need 177,000 signatures to go into a referendum. So that's a big number. And so she has to be very, mindful of how she handles this entire situation. The separatist sentiments that have been growing in Alberta are because of the frustrations with Ottawa, essentially saying that Ottawa really, it's a triangle, it's a trifecta of Ottawa, Toronto, and Montreal where the power is, and they don't look at the rest of the country. And then that's why there's energy regulations, not looking at Alberta, and massive economic concerns. Now this shift is, Premier Smith saying, hey, look, there's going to be pipeline access to Asian markets. This is going to reduce dependence on the US because we sell it below market rate to the United States. Now at least we can make a better profit by selling it to the Asian markets. And of course, for the separatist movement, perhaps they'll say, oh, Canada cares about us, and therefore, we'll have jobs and we'll have prosperity in the country. So that's why the Prime Minister has labeled this the grand bargain, because he gets to, let liberals in Canada show that, hey, there's going to be a carbon capture, and we're going to be competitive, and we're going to have energy security, and we're going to use our national, resources. So you have that playing out, and this carbon capture proposal is valued at $16.5 billion, and it would become one of the world's largest carbon capture systems designed to reduce emissions from Alberta oil sands production. And this is the amount that they both negotiated, which is less than what was previously there, but it's still a factor. So now the 5 pipeline routes under review, according to Premier Daniel Smith, is that these 5 possible export routes are now being evaluated, including Metro Vancouver and Northern BC corridors. There's still no final route, no private sector proponents, and no final federal approvals for it. So those are critical things to watch out for. When it comes to BC Premier David Eby, he has warned Alberta could gain an unfair advantage, essentially saying that if Ottawa allows Alberta lower carbon pricing than other provinces, then this will be an issue. So now this is something that Ottawa has to also take into consideration, that it can't just be something that's doing with Alberta and leave out the rest of the provinces. And when it comes to environmental opposition, it also is expected from First Nations and climate groups and anti-pipeline activists, which has been the case in Canada and elsewhere in the world. But when it comes to this major shift, is that this government is increasingly realizing that AI needs massive electricity, it needs grids. It also needs to have natural gas backup, right? You can't just rely only on electricity grids, and energy security is of the highest importance. So now Canada, we're seeing this massive shift in its policies when it comes to expanding its oil exports and, and expanding carbon capture. Nuclear is becoming a thing, with Ontario potentially having, the biggest nuclear power plant in the world, hydro and AI infrastructure. So this is the announcement today between the Prime Minister and Premier Daniel Smith, right? And then this is coming at a time where also, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government is also being tested, right? This entire Alberta separatist movement is a test to his prime ministership, right? Because if this movement continues and gains, momentum in terms of, now it's got a setback, which I'll describe what's happened. We talked about it briefly yesterday. It's not going to look so great on his watch as the prime minister. So you have this separatist movement, and the legal setback that it suffered yesterday was that the judge ruled the province failed to consult First Nations before allowing the petition process to go through, and which would trigger an independent referendum. Essentially, the court found that Alberta separation would directly impact treaty rights protected under the Canadian Constitution, and it would transform essentially the debate to what would be a political protest movement against the Constitution and Indigenous sovereignty issues. Premier Daniel Smith said that her government will appeal the decision, right? Because she always said, if there's enough signatures, we'll hold a referendum. So here she's backing up the separatist movement, right? Saying, you know what, my government will appeal this decision by the judge. While you have Indigenous leaders are saying, this is a major victory because they were able to uphold their treaty rights and national unity by saying, hey, you guys didn't consult us before you decided this petition and you submitted it, right? So this Alberta judge blocked the petition effort, which would essentially trigger a referendum in October, just months away. We're talking about 5 months away, and it ruled that the province failed to do what it was supposed to do in terms of this due diligence by consulting the First Nations, and whose treaty rights, supersede this petition, right? So this is the judge said, Alberta has a constitutional duty to consult indigenous nations, and the court found that Alberta's separation would impact treaties 7 and 8, which predate Alberta's existence itself. So this, supersedes that. Those treaties were in place before Alberta even was formed into a province, and as a province in Canada. So the judge essentially wrote in a statement that as a matter of logic and common sense, Alberta cessation would impact treaty rights. And the treaty rights are a central thing to this entire argument, because essentially it means that Alberta cannot just simply leave Confederation being part of Canada. And it couldn't just, fundamentally alter its constitutional relationships, right? Its land rights or its federal treaty obligations to the Indigenous First Nations communities. And so it can't just decide to do that, and that the Constitution and Indigenous sovereignty is a fact that it's a legal binding fact that predates Alberta's existence. So the separatist campaign, right, was run by Stay Free Alberta. They submitted just a few weeks ago 301,000 signatures supporting the referendum. The legal threshold is 177,000. So politically, they could, trigger this referendum, because Daniel Smith was elected after Premier Jason Kenney. It was Daniel Smith, and she was pro all of this if the people of Alberta, went through the process of this petition. Now, what's coming to an issue here is then you had the concerns on how was this data obtained, right? So we covered the story on Elections Alberta, essentially saying that 2.9 million Albertans' information has been leaked, and that was part of the process of, these separatist movements. A few of them, like Centurion, is the one that the legal proceedings are against, that they allegedly took sensitive data and it was available online. And to that, we cover the story on, former Premier Jason Kenney's address being online and that he may take legal actions for it. So with this whole separatist movement, there was the issue of the data breach, and then now there's the issue with, it being kicked out of court because of the First Nations treaty laws that it was, it violated. But we'll see what the might of the Alberta government will do when it comes to appeal this, and what it means for this petition that we're looking at a few months ahead on a referendum. And the other thing is, if the appeal fails for, on behalf of the Alberta government, will that subside this separatist movement? Probably not. It would probably inflame it even more, because the whole point of the separatist movement was because, Ottawa doesn't care. Ottawa is not listening to us, is not looking at the reality of our economy here in Alberta, and it's coming up with laws that would be anti-productive and hurtful to Alberta's economy. And as this movement, gets almost double the signatures that it requires for a referendum vote, and then now gets suppressed by a judge, and then the Alberta government can't do anything about it. So, it's going to be very critical to watch how Premier Danielle Smith handles all of this on the heels of making this massive announcement with Prime Minister Mark Carney today on what it means. Now, there's another thing that has come out today, which is very critical to be able to kind of observe, and reports that have come out about this controversial legislation, Bill C-22, which is the main issue on lawful access. Okay, so this bill is known as Lawful Access Act. It's proposing that law would reportedly expand police and intelligence access to digital communications, require telecoms and tech providers to build interception capabilities, and force some companies to retain user data for up to 1 year. And critics of this bill are saying that Canada is moving more closer to what would be a European-style digital surveillance powers. Like, if you've been to the UK and if you've traveled in London, you'll see like there's cameras everywhere, right? Like your digital presence, you'll be caught on camera. I forget the stats of how many times, because of how many cameras are in London. And that's been part of, this is part of what the critics are saying, is Canada going to turn into a policing state around what this bill is proposing? So now, why would Americans care about this? Because this has come up through, some of their media, as well as that the U.S. privacy advocates are worrying. They're saying that Canadian laws could affect American tech firms because we use American technology, right? Like, you got a Gmail, that's an American company. You use Facebook, it's an American company. You use Instagram, you use WhatsApp, those are all American companies, right? And if you use Microsoft, it's an American company. You use Zoom, it's an American company. We use American companies, right? And these are American tech firms. And so this cross-border communication and cloud infrastructure and data sharing agreements that are in place, this would be impacted, right? And so major US tech companies that are also operating in Canada and store Canadian data would also be subject to this bill that would pass, because now they have information that it could be acquired by Canadian law enforcement, right? So essentially, the Canadian legal changes can indirectly affect Americans because we're talking about American firms. So now, when it comes to immigration and border powers, that is also another major thing in Bill C-12, which is another bill which is strengthening border enforcement and anti-trafficking powers and immigration restrictions. But critics to that are saying that, it might refuse refugee protections and increase discriminatory state powers and make asylum seekers and claims a little bit harder. But supporters of Bill 12 are saying that Canada needs stronger border controls during this migration pressures and fentanyl trafficking. That's been part of what President Trump said, is coming through the Canadian borders, or what comes from the American side as guns into Canada. So, which of course, you have fentanyl, guns, which go into organized crime and create the security threats. So this is, some of the legislation that Canada's looking at as it's facing its concerns over foreign interference and AI generated disinformation or potential cyber attacks. And of course, what we saw happen with the separatist movement with the data breach on the voters database, 2.9 million Albertans. So you have all of that. And you have organized crime. And how Canada's been dubbed as a place where money laundering happens, right? And it's not doing enough to curtail its money laundering activities. So, in a time where you have these geopolitical tensions taking place, Canada's looking at how is it going to create more information and monitoring situations. So that's kind of what's at bay here. But, the American side is looking at this as this could play into the CUSMA negotiations as a potential irritant for the Americans. But of course, on the Canadian side, there is a debate on civil liberties because the critics are arguing, will governments be using, expanding their surveillance powers and, and having warrantless data access or digital, privacy infringements, and will this mean in terms of expanded police powers, or would this mean reduced judicial oversight, where all these things are kind of being exposed in terms of governments and police having access to critical data, and especially digital data. We know most of our lives are now online, and we have a digital footprint on there. So here's some of the concerns that could be playing into what is to come on this CUSMA negotiations that are going to be taking place. Now, because of this trade issue that has been going on with the United States, we know that American alcohols have been kept off the shelf. But now, latest reports are showing that Canada's wine industry is becoming collateral damage as there is a growing global trade and economic slowdown. So the latest numbers came out of that, wineries across Niagara and British Columbia and other regions are facing pressures from tariffs. And they're saying that these retaliatory trade measures are essentially hurting wine consumption, and this is a critical thing. So numbers came out, that because of the trade war that took place and it hit alcohol market really hard. The numbers that came out was when it comes to U.S. alcohol exports to Canada, it reportedly collapsed 72%. It fell from $744 million USD to $208 million. So it's a massive drop in those numbers. And when it comes to Canadian wine, it also is facing major pressures because of just the global wine demand is falling short, and you have younger consumers are drinking less. Actually, there's there are drinks that are coming out now that are a thing in some of those metropolitan cities in America where it's not alcohol, so for like networking events for a younger generation, but it's beverages that I guess relax you, and that's now heavily being replaced with alcohol. And when it comes to a younger consumer market, and when you have inflation prices, that's of course, when you have discretionary spending, it's going to impact some of those items as well. So global wine consumption has hit its lowest since, 1957, and that's becoming a thing. But it's hurt Ontario, Niagara, and in BC, and they're really feeling the pressure when it comes to their wine region. Even Nova Scotia, PEI, and those counties and those areas are definitely feeling it, because some of those producers, like when it comes to British Columbia's Okanagan area that has wineries, it's faced wildfires and climate volatility in the last little while, and labor shortages. But overall, the demand has dropped, and it's been the lowest since 1961. So massive to that, and we've seen that number also being hurt on the American side in terms of the demand dropping because of this whole Buy Canadian movement that's been going on in Canada, in terms of supporting local businesses and making sure that the consumption is here in Canada. So lots of things, and of course we're going to be keeping an eye on this CUSMA renegotiation that's going to happen in a month and a half, and what that means for Canadians. And so lots of things. And we'll bring you the latest when this announcement takes place today for the Prime Minister and Premier Danielle Smith. It is a massive announcement. It's historic because it means more pipelines, and it's keeping its agreements on when it comes to climate change and green energy. That's all the time we have today. I'm Ramona saying this is the Ymedia Newsroom. Until Monday, take care and be well.